Jandhyala, and the book is The Great Disruption: How Geopolitics is Changing Companies, Managers, and Work. I had maybe two objectives in writing the book. The first objective was really, I saw the book as the timing of the book as something which is relevant, because the people who are leading companies, who are having to sit in the midst of these changes, making these decisions about, what should companies do, they came of age at a different time, in an era where global forces were actually creating opportunities rather than creating challenges. So it was not that geopolitics was not important. Of course it was important, but it was opening markets. It was creating more opportunities. So they came of age really at a time when it was quite different. And so one of the goals with the book was to try to maybe bring a little bit more nuance into the conversation about what should companies do, what should managers do, how are we thinking about these problems, what are the issues that are front and central. So that was maybe one goal. The other goal was really to open conversations, to start engaging more with trying to understand better what is happening, how are different people in different sectors, industries, roles really managing, navigating, what are they seeing on the ground, and really to have a conversation about that. A lot of the challenges that companies face are not necessarily about what they do, but who they are. A lot of the challenges really are not about the products that they offer, not about the technological evolution that they have had, not about how good their customer service or their ability to introduce new models. Those are the typical kinds of things, or the pricing or the branding. These are the typical kinds of things that we expect companies to compete over. Like, this is what we think is market competition. But one of the learnings that I've had is a lot of how geopolitics is impacting companies has nothing to do with these types of market factors. A lot of it has to do with where you're from or what the corporate nationality of the company is. And the restrictions that you face or the opportunities that you glean out of these may simply be because of where you're from, right? And this works both ways. If you think about tariffs as an example, sure, if you are a shrimp farmer in India, you face different tariffs than if you are a shrimp farmer in Ecuador, but that's, again, nothing to do with the product or the quality, but it's simply because of where you're from. And that can be both a source of relative advantage, but also a relative disadvantage. So I think that was a way of thinking about what the problem really is, that could fundamentally change our way of thinking about what should we then do to address this problem. So it's not about, am I producing a better product? But it's really about where you're from. One of the things that I try to do in my classes is giving perspective. So I remember talking about exactly the same types of issues even 15 years ago. I mean, maybe the students didn't care so much about it because they thought the world was different, and rightly so. But it's also important for us to kind of provide perspective. So maybe even if it's not something that they see immediately being relevant, it's something that I think that we try to do in terms of, the world is changing, but it has not always been this way, and we don't expect it to always be this way. And the other part really is, I think, training our students and providing opportunities for them to develop critical thinking skills. That's probably the most important skill that they can build. The one thing that I try to emphasize is saying, when there is a lot of flux, there are also a lot of opportunities for companies to be profitable, to be making money, to be engaged and innovative. And really it takes a little bit of creativity and thinking maybe a little bit outside the box, or thinking differently than what people used to in the past. Every time there is flux, and it doesn't matter whether it's technological flux or whether it's geopolitical flux or other types of changes that are happening, there will be actors and there will be companies that have this ability to think creatively or come up with ideas that are in a way a break from the past and find avenues to be successful. And I think what we need to emphasize, not just, of course, managing every day and kind of overcoming the barriers, overcoming some of the challenges that maybe your company didn't have last year or the year before, is a task that needs to be handled. But at the same time, I think we should also recognize that flux is also about opportunity. And so flux, when there is all of this change going on, we really need to rewire the way we think. And those who can do it creatively and imaginatively are going to be successful. They will find opportunities to come up with a new business model, to come up with a new way of engaging and undertaking business. So I really think that it is also about opportunity, not just about challenges. One big challenge, for example, is going to be the ability of companies to navigate and really just understand political forces, the dynamics of geopolitics, and for that, scale is going to be somewhat of an advantage, right? So if you have the ability to dedicate resources, if you have a global affairs team, or you have a government affairs, a public affairs division, and you can afford to fund that division well, then yes, you do have a leg up somewhat in just monitoring what's going on, to be able to respond, to be able to have a contingency plan in place, and move quickly and inform your staff and identify opportunities that may exist. So because these are expensive functions for an organization, but they're also not functions that you can typically build very quickly overnight. So this is why I think there is probably somewhat of an advantage for larger companies. But I don't think all of the advantage necessarily rests with larger companies. And one reason for that is because large companies also tend to be very entrenched. It's very hard to change a large company. It's very hard to move things around or suddenly decide that I want to pivot in a business plan, or that I want to change the way I organize my company, or even, a simple org design change is going to be very fraught. Lots of vested interest within the company. Is very difficult to pull this off. Smaller companies are at a relative advantage because they can do these kinds of move, pivot, switch much faster and maybe more easily than large companies can do. So if they are able to identify an opportunity and they have creative solution, I suppose it's probably much more likely to be implemented and take place within smaller companies, maybe even new startups, rather than existing companies. But also, I would expect that there would be many more startups or new companies that are founded that have a completely different business model, that from the get-go are organized differently, that could be successful as well. I think the way I look at this is essentially companies, global businesses, companies that are expanding abroad, companies that are looking to do business with other partners, suppliers, entities, clients in a different market. They need some kind of institutional scaffolding, some kind of support structure to enable them to continue engaging internationally. Because global business is hard, even in the best of times. It's hard because you don't know those cultures, you don't know those markets, you don't know or are unfamiliar with what politics looks like in another country, or the institutional structure looks like in another location. So it's hard even in the best of times. So most companies, to be able to expand internationally and to have some confidence of it's worthwhile for me to undertake this risky proposition, they really require the kind of institutional scaffolding that will give them confidence, that will allow them to say, this is a risk that I'm willing to take. And generally, that kind of institutional scaffolding comes down to a few things. One is about ensuring that there is market access, that continued access to a market. So if a company decides that they're going to invest a lot of money in another country or another market, they want to be sure that that's an investment that's worth making when they feel confident that they will continue to have market access. The second is about a level playing field, that they feel like when they go into that market, or when they're competing with other global businesses, that they're competing on a somewhat level playing field where the competition is about market factors rather than non-market issues. And the third is about just investment security, whether it is about your physical assets, whether it is about human assets. To what extent do you feel confident that your assets are going to be safe, that your physical property, plants, infrastructure, but also your managers, your employees are going to be safe in the markets that you operate in? And then finally, the last element I think that's really important is ensuring institutional alignment. Now, for a company that operates across multiple countries, it is really expensive to try to kind of modify their operations and readjust all the technical standards from one country to another country, or different institutional conditions from one country to another. Some of this is just reality. This is they have to deal with it, and that's kind of built into global businesses. But to the extent that we have similar technical standards, that would really help in limiting some of the or minimizing some of these costs. So really for global businesses, what I see as the challenging parts going forward are these four dimensions. To what extent do they feel like they can continue to have market access? To what extent do they feel like they're competing on a level playing field? How safe and secure do they think their property and investments and human capital are going to be? And how much of friction is there going to be because everybody's using a different standard and a different metric? So how much institutional alignment? The Apple iPhone example, this is a great example of a company that really needs to make this decision in a way because the political forces are now not necessarily the same as when Apple first started investing in China. So they are kind of reevaluating where to put their production and where to have a large part of their operations. When there is so much uncertainty, a decision like this cannot be easily reversed. Right? So if you decide that you're going to move a large part of your production from one country to another, this is expensive to do. It takes a really long time to pull off, and it's not a decision that can easily be reversed. So if there are changes from one week to the next or from 1 month to the next, a company like this cannot keep changing or updating what their plan is like week to week or month to month. So these are long-term strategic decisions that are difficult to reverse by the very nature of these types of strategic decisions. Having that sense of some predictability into the future is what they're looking at. They're probably trying to assess, and every company is trying to assess, if we see a policy change or if we see some kind of pushback, is this long lasting? Is this something that might go away or might change or might be different in a week or a month or a year, versus this is going to be the new reality that I have to adjust to? And I think reasonable people can come to different conclusions because they're all projecting out into the future. So I expect that companies will make different types of decisions because they may have the same information and uncertainty about the information, but their reading of that information may be very different. So they might come to a different conclusion or assessment about how they project out into the future. And that will kind of shape where they go or how much they invest or how to what extent they want to make a change today versus wait until later to get more information. AI is like another great revolution or disruption that is happening at the same time. But in some ways, I feel like the geopolitical disruption is going to impact the nature and the shape of the technological disruption or the technological evolution. And we already see this, for example, when we think about the AI arms race or the export controls on semiconductor chips or algorithms and so on. So in a way, I think geopolitics is shaping where companies go, what kind of investments they make, even in the technology sector, and especially so in AI, where a lot of governments are looking at AI not just as something that can improve productivity or like a tool like ChatGPT that I use to help me in my work or whatever, but really as a national security issue. And to the extent that it is a national security issue, expect that there will be more government intervention, not less. Governments will be much more interested in trying to really shape not just how the technology evolves, but who has access to that technology, where the technology can be deployed. What are the use cases that we will be allowed to have free access, and what are the use cases where there will be more restrictions? So the technology itself may exist, but how that's deployed, who gets access to it, under what conditions. Now, all of this is going to, in some way, be shaped by geopolitics. Right? So in a way, as much as AI is kind of like pushing the frontier and really showing to us like the technological ability to reshape fundamentally how we work and how companies operate and how we even play. But I think there's a layer over and above that, which is like the geopolitics is in some way shaping the technological trajectory itself. There is this debate that is being had in countries around the world in terms of who should be where, essentially, right? So who is allowed to be where to do what kind of work? It is a difficult discussion, and there are many kind of challenges to it. But at the same time, for a lot of companies that have come to kind of expect some of these barriers, if not to go away, but to become less onerous, they're now kind of discovering that they have to figure out how we need to operate in a world where, again, the movement of talent or movement of people is not necessarily the same as what they thought it was going to be, or their projections of what they thought it was going to be into the future. So this could, in a way, democratize work as well. That's one possibility. But as with other things, there is also a huge agglomeration effect for talent, right? So when you have a consolidated group of people working in a particular geographic area, there's very high spillovers of knowledge. There's very high potential for those areas to become very highly developed and really speed up the technological evolution, because there's a huge spillover effect, and there's this agglomeration effect. So these are kind of, I think, opposing forces. Like on the one hand, you do want agglomeration because it really helps to spur more innovation. On the other hand, there's this idea of democratizing work and really making it available to anybody, anywhere. So I think these are two different forces, and really the balance in the middle somewhere is where we're probably going to end up. I do think that more and more, the possibility or the availability of virtual work is going to be shaped not by technology, but by geopolitics. Let's think about the three aspects of virtual work, like your virtual work, that you will be allowed to do the kind of work that you have the ability to do. Or whatever is your regular day job. That's the first promise of virtual work, is that your job can be done virtually or from somewhere else. But geopolitics has kind of shown us that the nature of the work itself is changing. So for many companies, people are being pulled into different types of functions. A lot of it has to do with scanning the environment and trying to assess what the developments are. So the nature of the work itself has changed. But even if you keep that aside, your ability to do virtual work, the assumption is that it can be done from anywhere. Right? So this is the promise of virtual work, that as long as you have Wi-Fi, good Wi-Fi connection and your trusty laptop, you can work from anywhere. And I think, again, geopolitics is challenging that, because increasingly we have restrictions on cross-border data transfer. We have more restrictions on localizing data storage. Where data is generated, it has to be stored only in those locations. There are restrictions on who can access a database, even within the same company, depending on which office location you are in a multinational corporation. So the idea that, yeah, maybe there's access to a digital nomad visa that gives you the promise of I can be on a beach and I can, dial in to work, increasingly is running into this challenge of geopolitics, where there are restrictions on cross-border data transfer. There's restrictions on locations from which you can access the same database, even within the same company. Companies are increasingly telling their employees to use not their regular work devices, but temporary travel devices. So all of these restrictions, in a way, are taking away from the promise of virtual work, that you can do this work anywhere, that you can be anywhere. And then on top of that, we are adding restrictions on who can do the work, right? So we were talking earlier about restrictions on movement of people, but also there's restrictions on who it can access or do certain types of work. Now, if you think about industries like defense, this was always the case, right? So if you wanted to work for a defense company, usually there will be restrictions on who can be employed at a defense, what kind of security clearance you can get, and so on. But increasingly, what geopolitics is showing us is that you don't need to be in a defense sector to have these kinds of restrictions or these kinds of challenges about who can be employed to do a certain type of work, or where that work can be taken on. And so the promise of virtual work, we'll democratize work, anyone can do the work can be done from anywhere. Technology may let us do it. Right? Maybe the technology is there and it's probably just getting better and better, but I think the broader geopolitical forces are really causing companies to rethink what this means, um, whether they can really implement this kind of virtual work. I mean, in the end, we may just end up with saying virtual work is simply, you know, I can work from home in the same location that I am in. I just don't need to make the trek to the office, right? So maybe that's it. I don't know, but really, it's forcing us to rethink and reevaluate. Technology may allow us to do it, but I think the geopolitical forces are not necessarily aligned in the same direction. Already, we're at a point where we are trying to assess what is the right type of data that I need. So if I have a problem or a company is looking at an issue, identifying what may possibly be different data sources or different metrics that you can use. Just identifying which of these is a credible source, which of these is a source that really speaks to the questions that I'm interested in addressing. Already, I think we're at a point where that's becoming increasingly hard. But on top of that, a lot of these are getting increasingly privatized, meaning that even public data, to the extent that it is provided to users in a more user-friendly way, is becoming more common. We have lots of data vendors that do that. And so just, I think there's a lot of data evolution that is happening right now. And governments are going to increasingly have an interest, but also, as this becomes much more difficult to navigate, a role to play in kind of identifying what those pathways are. Forget even the cross-border element of this. Even within a country, how should we govern the data infrastructure? I think that's a big challenge that's on the minds of many people. One of the insights that I gained for myself, and when I started looking at this problem, I thought it was something that companies could manage or could build the skills to navigate the geopolitical systems, and certainly that is the case. But one of the things that I learned from this is how much of the challenge is really about where the company is from, right? The corporate nationality, as I call it. One of the learnings that I've had from the book is really how this is impacting all types of companies, whether this is small or large, whether this is in traditionally what we consider to be national security sensitive industries or not. If you think about companies all across the spectrum, right? So it is not about defense industries only. This is also about TikTok videos or, like your shopping that a teenager does on one of these e-commerce sites. So a lot of really industries that we don't really expect in the traditional sense to be impacted by geopolitics, I think have been shaped and reshaped and continue to be affected by these kinds of factors. So really the impact has been seen across a very, very large spectrum.